So it's my privilege to introduce the introducer. The person who's going to introduce the president, Douglas Brinkley. He's a PhD professor of history at Rice University. He was named America's new past master by the Chicago Tribune. He's a CBS News historian, a contributing editor at Vanity Fair, Los Angeles Times Book Review, and the American Heritage, as well as a contributor to the New York Times, the New Yorker, and the Atlantic Monthly. 7 of his books have been selected as New York Times Notable Books of the Year. Please welcome Douglas Brinkley.
Well, it's a great honor to get to introduce Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter, the former president and first lady, and here in Aspen. And let me begin by just telling you President Carter is a great and good and brave man. And we all know his storied career up from Plains and through the Naval Academy into Georgia politics to the White House, and then this extraordinary post-presidency that he's doing with the Carter Center. And many of us can rattle off things that President Carter's known for, like injecting human rights into our parlance in foreign policy making. Only Eleanor Roosevelt is his equal in that regard. That he was the president that recognized the People's Republic of China officially during his White House tenure. That he's the president of the great Camp David peace accords, where he took Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin into the woods in Maryland in a natural setting and hammered out that essential piece of good news in a world that's often goes wrong. I could go on and on with obscure bits. I mean, of things like he was the first, as the sitting president, was the first to actually go to Africa while he was president, although it was very briefly. And of course, the Panama Canal treaties. But we're here today to honor Jimmy Carter as one of the great conservationist environmental presidents. Only Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt are his equal. And I'm writing the story of presidents in the environment, and it's Jimmy Carter's great unsung legacy. Even when he was governor of Georgia, he had the temerity in an era where really great society Democrats in the South wanted a dam. I mean, FDR started Dam-a-mania. With the TVA and Grand Coulee Dam and Bonneville Dam and the like. And Jimmy Carter looked into it and said, no, we don't need to dam the Flint River of Georgia. Jimmy Carter's the one who looked all over the landscape of a state as governor and said, we have to save heritage sites. If you enjoy the coastal areas of Georgia, Governor Carter's the reason why. He always was a preservationist, always an outdoorsman, always a fly fisherman, always somebody who was happy taking walks in the woods, always a great custodian of the land. And as president, I'm just going to rattle off a few, he fought for the passage of the Alaska Lands Bill, which protected more than 150 million acres of wild lands and scenic rivers. We have yet to come up to what that means, that he literally saved Alaska wilderness for future generations. And that accomplishment's going to look bigger and bigger in the future. And it was brave to do it, and he did it well. His Secretary of Interior, Cecil Anders, was one of the great Interior Secretaries. Only maybe Harold Ickes and Stuart Udall are his equals. Beyond all of that Alaska Lands Bill, President Carter fought for the Superfund legislation that provided monies and a director to clean up toxic waste dumps all over the United States. And what would we be today without that vision of a Superfund? He also promoted legislation to strictly control strip mining, something that's becoming even more and more important now. And his promotion of renewable energy as symbolism of putting the solar panels on the White House, which was met with ridicule by many, now looks prescient, as does his famous speech, which when he talked about keeping our thermostats down and not being such a huge consumer of energy and try to be a little wiser about it. And I don't think we could have a better person to serve as interlocutor with President Carter than Sally Rainey, co-founder and president of the American Renewable Energy Institute, and co-founder of the International Women's Earth and Climate Action Network. She's worked with all presidents since Ronald Reagan. In many ways, she's our impresario of this event. Now we're going to get to watch her at work with President Jimmy Carter as they discuss issues about climate change and environmental protection that are near and dear to our hearts. Thank you.
All right.
Welcome.
There we are, right?
Well, this is unbelievable for me. Unbelievable. And what an honor to be here with you and to talk with you about your vision and what worked and what didn't work when you were president.
We'll talk about what worked.
Yes. But I have some questions about why it didn't that might inform us for the future. Okay. So you put in place the Energy Department. And that was a major piece of legislation and vision. And it was embraced by most, but you had a difficult time, as I understand it. And you had a lot of issues to contend with besides energy as well. So I wanted to ask you, now that we know that climate change is advancing the way it is, if you had an opportunity to recraft energy policy at this moment in time, what would that look like? What kind of timetables would you put on it? And how would you get it executed, given the polarization in Congress?
Well, let me say, first of all, there was a different time then. We concentrated on almost exclusively reducing our dependence on foreign oil. So we did it by conservation and renewable energy, those two things. And I emphasize research and development and the creation of I would say, private investment in energy efficiency. So we greatly enhanced the efficiency of house building and electric motors and refrigerators and stoves. All that went into the laws of America and couldn't be changed by subsequent presidents, whom I won't name. And in the process, I think we proved one thing, and that was that it was a job-creating process, because we had very high inflation rates toward the end and also very high interest rates. But during the 4 years I was in office, we created an average of 2 million jobs per year, which no one else has done since the Second World War. And the reason was that we emphasized energy efficiency and energy independence. And so almost all of those jobs were related directly or indirectly to private enterprise and government promoting the two items, renewable energy and also efficiency of use of energy. So that was, but we didn't know about climate change and the impact of human beings on creating climate change until 1979, when some scientists at Woods Hole Institute in Massachusetts came and talked to my science advisor, Dr. Frank Press, and said, we believe that there is a gradual increase in global warming, and we also believe that the major cause is because of creation of carbon dioxide and other items in the air. So anyway, that was the origin of it. I think now the opportunity is even greater for us to take action, but we had very good support then from the Republican side of the Congress. I had just as much support from the Republicans as I did Democrats for the energy policies that were put into effect. And we also tied that in with environment, which Doug Brinkley has already pointed out quite wisely. So nowadays, I think that the two things should be emphasized. One is renewable energy, and secondly is efficiency of the use of energy. And we've seen some countries devote themselves to renewable energy. For instance, Canada now has 64% of their energy from renewable supplies. And that's because they have a lot of hydropower and so forth. But say North Korea is the second. They have 62% of their energy from renewable energy because they don't have any money to buy fuel oil, and because the United States has had an embargo on them for 62 years as well. And then you come down to, say, China has about 18% renewable energy already and rapidly moving toward solar and wind. And say Great Britain and France and Russia have about 16 or 17%. The United States is right at the bottom. We still only have 10% of our energy from renewable supplies. So we have a tremendous opportunity to do what other countries have done that we haven't tapped yet. And we are now beginning to do it to some degree. We also had challenges that are similar to today. We had, when I became president, the average automobile efficiency was 12 miles per gallon. And we increased it tremendously, but we set a goal for 28 miles per gallon by the year 2000. And we got all of the automobile manufacturers to agree to it. They all came to the White House to agree that we still haven't quite reached 28 miles per gallon. Now we've set a goal, I think, by 2030 to have 46 miles per gallon and 54 eventually. By the way, Europe and Japan have already passed the 45 mile per hour limit. So the point I'm making is that the efficiency of automobiles and other things and use of renewable energies has already been proven in other countries to be feasible for accomplishments. But I would say the biggest handicap we have right now is some nutcases in our country that don't believe in global warming.
It's true.
But I think, to close my long and rambling answer, I think that they are going to change their position because of pressure from individuals, because the evidence of the ravages of global warming that's coming are already there. A few years ago, Rosa and I landed in Alaska, and the top headlines in the Alaska papers was, we will have no more polar bears in 25 years. And they pointed out to me, the lieutenant governor with whom I went around the state with, that a lot of the villages on the coast occupied by Eskimos and Indians primarily are now having to close down completely because the ice shelter is gone and the sea level rising has closed them down. We have a lot of programs around the world. We have 80 programs, programs in 80 countries in the world right now for the Carter Center. And one of our big interests is in Bolivia. I would say Bolivia is going to be the first complete nation who will suffer from global warming because all of their ice caps are melting, as you know. And our first place we lived when Rose and I got married 68 years ago, by the way, we lived in Norfolk, Virginia. And Norfolk, Virginia now has seawater coming up on their streets out of the storm drains and so forth. And you probably noticed that the EPA equivalent in Virginia declared that the offshore island property was going to be flooded at least 3 feet deep in the future, and the property was going to become worthless. And now they've withdrawn that information from the public. On the Outer Banks, that's where I used to operate on the submarine right off of that. So I have seen personally how the ravages of global warming are becoming more and more evident. And I would guess that even the most right-wing Republican senator and Congress member within the next 5 or 6 years are going to have proven to them in the United States and other places that they've got to change their position. And they are very flexible in changing their position to accommodate political exigencies, and I think they're going to change. So I don't look on the present holdup concerning changing to renewable energy to be an insoluble problem. I think what's going to happen in this country is going to convince even the most recalcitrant member of Congress we've got to change too. And the last thing I'll say is I go to China every year. I've been a very popular person in China since I normalized relations 35 years ago this year, and I'm going over to help celebrate that. I'll be there the 1st of September, and I have always felt that the best key to getting international support for correcting global warming or meeting the challenge is for the United States and China to agree on anything that would reduce global warming, and if they agree on anything, no matter what it is, the rest of the world will go along with it. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about.
Excellent. Thank
I've over-answered your question, I'm afraid. But
you. Well, it was a big question.
yeah, it was.
It was a big question. I will say that Ted Turner has an island that is also suffering from
Yes.
sea rise, and he's had to put in millions of dollars of revetments, like every other year, every third year, because of rising sea. It's now rising seas. He now has it for sale, and he says nobody will buy it. And I said, that's not true. Advertise it in all the climate skeptic publications you can find. It'll go like that. You made a very famous speech in 1979 about Americans having a lack of confidence, a lack of a lack of feeling moral responsibility, and that was why America couldn't move on some of these issues. And I just want to ask your opinion now. Do you think that we're in that same position as far as the American public, and is that why we can't act in our own best interests on climate change and energy policy?
Well, I think it's a lot worse now. You know, the country was not divided into red and blue states then, and money didn't completely control the campaign for Congress and for governor and for U.S. Senate and for president like it does now. As a matter of fact, when I ran for president against Gerald Ford, and later when I ran for president against Ronald Reagan, you know how much money we raised for the campaign? Zero.
Wow.
Because we just used public funds that people give $2 a year, and that's all the money we used. But now the money, I think the money pouring in and the ridiculous ruling by the Supreme Court that corporations are people has caused this to change. Ben, so I think that this is something that's going to change. I believe, though, that almost anything that President Obama advocates, and he's been very forceful in the last few months on climate change and done a very good job on that, anything that he proposes, the Congress is going to oppose. And so we have almost a complete deadlock in the Congress now. As I said earlier, I got almost as much support from Republicans as I did Democrats when I was in president. So the whole environment is changing, and now, of course, the skeptics on global warming are very powerful in this country, and I think they are being overly effective in blocking any sort of conviction that we need something like a carbon tax, which I think is the only reasonable approach, and that can be done all global. If that can be done all over the world, then that would be very forceful. But I think that the Chinese are moving quite rapidly now toward adoption of what's effectively a carbon tax. And if the United States would go along with that, I think the rest of the world would go.
Do you think if there's enough grassroots organizations that really can work on the ground and push against those who are not doing the right thing by climate change and energy policy, and we could get them out of office and get those in?
All right.
What do you think about that?
Well, if we could take our day and multiply it by 1,000, we'll have it, done, I think. but I think that a few people like here today, and many of them have talked to me during the lunch break and so forth. I think if we can marshal our forces, like Amory Lovins came to see me when I was first in the White House, and he's now got a plan by which, without major investment, almost entirely by private corporations, we can solve all of our problems without any sort of sacrifice. In fact, we're giving every one of us a better life without financial sacrifice. So if we can adopt things like those ideas and get them to be put in people's consciousness, and then let the people themselves influence their members of Congress and the Senate, I think the United States will change. I would say up through George Bush Sr., George H.W. Bush, the United States was in the forefront of correcting global change with the Tokyo rounds and so forth. And he went to Rio de Janeiro now a little bit more than 20 years ago. And the United States was #1 country saying, let's do something about the environment. Since then, we haven't had any sort of leadership in the United States on the international basis to deal with these serious problems of energy overuse and that sort of thing. But now I believe that there's a growing interest in it. My partner in this is Mary Robinson, who happens to be the former president of Ireland, and she was the first High Commissioner on Human Rights for the United Nations. She's a fellow elder of mine. And Ban Ki-moon, the head of the United Nations, has just asked her to lead the global preparation for the big conference that's going to be held in Paris in 15, I think September 2015. And as you know, by March of 15, every country in the world is supposed to come forward and present their plan to deal with global warming. And so we only got a few months between now and March the 15th. March 2015, that's next year. There'll be a conference also in the United Nations in New York in September, right, which will be the first thing. So there are 3 steps. Mary Robinson and I spoke to a large group in Paris last fall about preparation for this conference. So I think that there's a building pressure on nations to do something just to withstand or avoid the condemnation of the rest of the world for not acting. And maybe that'll put some pressure on the United States.
Now, I know that you and Mary Robinson and one other elder wrote a letter,
yes, we did.
Encouraging and urging that there be action commensurate to the challenge of climate change. Were the other elders, did they sign on to that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. Former president of Mexico, Zedillo, was the 3rd one. But we wrote this letter. It's only a page and a half long, but we outlined very briefly, but I think forcefully, the right approach to dealing with global warming, and we sent it to every head of government on Earth. I think we sent it to like almost 200 heads of state, and urged them to begin to prepare for what I've just said recently about the company.
Another question that I had is, about the moral responsibility. We use that all the time to go that America needs to do the right thing, that we have a moral imperative to bring democracy to other countries. We use that moral imperative a lot to go into Afghanistan, to get involved in the Gaza-Israel Israeli conflict and the Ukraine, Russia and the United States. How come that same logic doesn't apply to moving on climate change?
Well, I think everybody in this room and every American almost considers our country to be a superpower, or the superpower. But we predicate that primarily on our power as a military country, because our military budget equals at least the budgets of the next 12 countries in line, 6 times as much as China's, for instance. And I think that we're going to begin to realize that being the major superpower on Earth is not just who dominates economics and military. But I would say that one of the characteristics of a superpower is to take the leadership on major issues that afflict or could afflict the rest of the world. And I think climate change is one of those symbolic but very tangibly important issues that would put the United States in the role of a true superpower. So I think for the so being a champion of a climate environment, being a champion of human rights, being a champion of peace, those are the kind of things that I think measure a superpower.
Do you think that the world leaders are capable at this moment in time to collaborate and to cooperate at a global level in order to achieve a binding treaty in Paris in 2015 on climate change?
I don't know whether I can predict success in Paris or not, but this will be, if we fail in Paris, it's going to be a major setback with a long-lasting adverse consequence. So in Europe, I've been to several countries in Europe recently, and I've been to France and Ireland and Norway and Sweden and Great Britain just recently. And there's a very strong interest in what's going to happen in Paris in 2015. In the United States, there's no mention of it, even in the most advanced, editorial writers, say in the New York Times and so forth. They never mention it. It's not even thought about. And as I just pointed out, in March of next year, which is now just a few months, we're supposed to present the U.S. policy, a plan for dealing with global warming. We are not even thinking about addressing it so far. So I would say the rest of the world is ahead of us. And as a matter of fact, the last 20 years, Europe has been in the leadership. And with Gro Brundtland, the former Prime Minister of Norway, and Mary Robinson and some others leading the pack. I think China has now waked up surprisingly. I go to China every year, and I always, the last 5 times I've been there, I've met with Xi Jinping to talk about major issues. And I would say that China is far ahead of the United States in trying to address the global warming problem because of the pressure from their own people who are breathing impure air and trying to irrigate out of streams that poison their crops and so forth. So I think the United States is now the laggard in almost the entire industrial world in dealing with climate change.
Well, in the case of China, they have a different political system where they can set a mandate.
Yeah, I've heard about it.
Yeah, you've heard about it.
It's true.
They can set a mandate, and they can say, we're going to do this by X date, and they put the resources and the focus on it, and it happens. And we don't have that system here, obviously, and it has really put us behind. If we had followed your lead in the 70s, we would have been 20% renewable by 2000.
That's right.
And President Reagan came in, and even though I worked with him on a variety of issues on public lands, when it came to energy, he was way behind the 8 ball. And he did not support, he took the panels off the White House, and he did not support some of the tax incentives you had put in place. He unraveled those. And we all know subsequently what has happened, and it has put this country way behind where we could have been. My next question is that has Obama's administration asked you for advice on these issues?
No. But let me say quickly that I just mentioned earlier that I think in the last few months, President Obama has seen that he's not going to get any cooperation from Congress, and he's doing the best he can under the EPA laws that were passed many years ago to try to correct the problem. So I think he's made some progress dealing with the major power producing companies in shifting away from coal and so forth, and also with setting standards at least for automobile efficiency. So I think he's moving now. And I was very disappointed the first 5 years he was in office that he just played, I'd say, a wait-and-see game as we went to the Rio Plus 20. And as we had earlier conferences in Copenhagen and so forth, the United States had practically nothing to say about global warming. But lately, I think he's doing the best he can.
You wanted to implement an energy mobilization board.
That's right.
Very similar to the World War II war production board. Because what it would have done is it would have galvanized the focus and all the resources to move an energy agenda forward. Do you think that under executive order, the president has been under a lot of criticism for his use of executive order, do you think that he could resurrect that and just move forward?
No, I don't think that such a board established by executive order without the cooperation of Congress, could have any viability to it. They could put in maybe some press releases and things like that, or maybe write a couple of editorials, but it wouldn't get anything done. But I think the Congress has got to be on board, to make any sort of an organization effective to change the basic policies of our country. The president can be the chief spokesman for it, but I don't believe that would be possible for executive order. And of course, he's stretching the point, for which I'm very grateful, about EPA authority. And now he's not only going to have to avoid a congressional veto and obstacles to that, but he's also going to have to make sure that whatever he does in interpreting the ancient laws of EPA, they can withstand federal challenges. Because the Supreme Court, in whom I have very little confidence on these kind of issues, I think will not stretch their influence to encompass a presidential directive based on existing laws. I don't want to be negative, but that's a fact.
Right. I want to loop back for a minute to Paris and the UNFCCC.
Yeah.
Only 31% of the delegates are women. And do you have any thoughts about, at this point in time, how to get more women into that decision-making process, because they are one half of the world's stakeholders in what happens there?
Yeah. Well, I've only mentioned 2 women so far. They're in a leadership. One is Gru Brundtland, and the other one is Mary Robinson. And they have been the leaders in the European arena. And so, of course, I would like to see a lot more women in that organization. But if you look on, say, public office in the world, then only 23% of the public office is occupied by women.
Right.
And the United States is now up to 15%. So we're about half the world's level on women elected to public office. So I think in every respect, certainly dealing with things that impact a human being's well-being or family's well-being, a woman's role there is probably superior just on an average to what a man would do because of their direct relationship with children and the well-being of individual people. So I would like to see many more go. But I think that Ban Ki-moon's choice of Mary Robinson to head up the entire United Nations effort was a very wise move.
Very
and I think Mary is one person I know in the world who is very eager to see women role increase in every way.
Yes, yes. And so I want to segue now to your book.
Okay.
This is a new book by President Carter, and it's a call to action: women, religion, violence, and power. I highly recommend that everybody read this. And yes, indeed. And in this book, President Carter goes through a bit of an anatomy about women and the role that they've had and haven't had, the subjugation of women over the course of history, and relates some of that with religion and interpretation of the Bible, the Quran, etc. And first of all, I want to know, why did it take you so long?
Well, let me say, to segue a little bit, this is the most important book I've ever written. And it's my 28th book. And I would say that global warming is the most important issue, politically and otherwise, that the world faces. The most important and devastating human rights abuse on earth is what's done to women and girls. And it's not being addressed. And so we began 3 years ago to have annual human rights conferences just devoted to the rights of women, because the Carter Center's work, which has been the last 30-something years of my life, has been primarily in Africa and in the poorest families on earth, in 80 different countries already mentioned. And so we began to see not only the abuse and deprivation of women's rights, but also the devastating impact of that on the families and the communities and the nations involved. Because when you deprive 50% of your total potential human resources of an equal chance to have an education and so forth, you hurt yourself. And so you can almost balance the rights of women with the economic development of a country in many ways. And so I began also to understand from visitation, say all the way through Africa. If you start on the East Coast and with say Ethiopia and Egypt and Somalia and go all the way across to Senegal, most of those countries, 80% of all the females living have had their genitals mutilated. And in some countries like Egypt, where we have constant programs, over 90% of all the living females have had their genitals mutilated. And if you look at the deprivation of women's rights in holding office, I've already mentioned that. But I'd say one of the worst and unknown problems is the number of baby girls who are executed by their parents at birth when they see that she's a female. Or now with the advent of sonograms, they can tell when a fetus is going to be a girl and they abort it. And I would say the worst catastrophe we've had in history has been the Second World War, where 40 million people died. At this moment, there are 160 million, 4 times as many, females missing from the face of the earth who've been killed by their parents. Because in China and in India and other places, there's a great pressure on families to be small. 1 is best, 2 is most. And then in other countries where the poverty is so horrible, parents can't afford to have 5 or 6 children. And the mothers continue to have babies without any birth control, and so they execute children. There's a new movie that came out in November called It's a Girl. And there's one Indian woman in that movie who very proudly points out that she strangled 8 baby girls when they were born. So that's what goes on. And it's not just in foreign countries. In our country here, the State Department is now required by law to make a report on what we call human trafficking, which is slavery. And they reported that last year in the United States of America, 160,000 girls were sold into sexual slavery in our country. Atlanta, Georgia, is in the leadership. We have between 200 and 300 girls imported into Atlanta and sold into sexual slavery every month. And the reason is that we've got the largest and most busy airport on earth in Atlanta, and a lot of the customers that come in are from the southern hemisphere, where the girl's skin is brown or black. And a brothel owner in Atlanta or other places in the southeast can buy a colored girl of some kind for $1,000, where a white girl costs a lot more. And so this goes on, and I would say 2 more things if I can summarize my book very quickly. One of the worst places in America for sexual abuse is one of our greatest pride, and that is the university system. There's not a single university in America that is not afflicted with sexual abuse. And now 2 very notable female senators in the U.S. Congress is now working on this, and they were on 60 Minutes the other night, and they pointed out that 41% of all the universities in America have not reported a sexual abuse case in the last 5 years. And 1 out of 5 girls who goes through an American university is sexually abused while she's in school. But the problem is that nobody wants to know about it or admit it, because a college president and deans, the last thing they want to admit is that they got sexual abuse on the campus. So when a girl is raped, that their first thing is to talk to the girl and say, look, we'll give you psychological counseling, we'll give the boy psychological counseling, but let's don't rock the boat. And so it's not done. And the same thing applies in the other great institution, and that is our armed forces. So you see that it's not only in other countries, but in our country as well. So this is the greatest single human rights abuse on earth, and mostly it's not acknowledged or addressed. Thank you for letting me. I might add one thing. Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Just one more thing. And later I'm going to be signing my book, by the way, but in the last chapter, I write 23 different things that any person can do to correct those problems. And some of them are fairly simple. You can do yourselves in your own family, and also to address the United Nations and government. So I didn't just point out the problems, but also very specifically recommendations.
So I want to go a little bit deeper into this. Why women have been treated this way and subjugated to all of these abuses for centuries. And with all due respect, I find the Bible a little bit like the internet, in that you can find and interpret whatever your position or your ideology is, and then you can kind of work in a silo if you want to.
Right.
So what's the root cause of this really? Are men, if all of our emotions and our actions come out of love or fear, it's obviously not coming from love. So what, in your opinion, is the fear that is so profound that it has kept women in this place within the whole of humanity for centuries?
Well, I cover that quite extensively, maybe excessively in the book. When the Christian faith was begun with Jesus Christ, he was the unequal champion of women's rights compared to all other leaders that we've seen on earth. And when the Islamic faith was founded many years later, it was the Quran, which I've studied very thoroughly in preparing this book, was also a very enlightened and progressive document to elevate the status of women compared to what it was then. But in the Bible, for instance, the Holy Bible, there are 34,000 or so verses. And over centuries, the men have gotten into control of the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches and Islamic faith, and also in other faiths as well. And they have interpreted certain specific verses in the Quran and in the Bible to show that men are superior. And I've, in this book, tried to point out the fallacies in doing that, and also to point out that even St. Paul, who's now quite often blamed for derogating women, pointed out that there's no difference between a man and woman, or a Greek or Hindu, or a Greek or a Jew, or a black or white person, or a slave or master in the eyes of God. And in the first centuries, the first 3 centuries of the Christian church, women were in the leadership role. If you don't believe me, just read the 16th chapter of Romans, where Paul congratulates women for their leadership as bishops and priests and so forth. Now, though the Catholic Church, which I admire very much, doesn't permit women to be priests or deacons. And the Southern Baptist Convention, which Rosa and I withdrew from 14 years ago because of this, ordained that a woman couldn't be a priest or a deacon, and that a woman couldn't even teach a classroom of students if a boy was in the classroom. And a woman in the Southern Baptist Convention can't be a chaplain in the Army or Navy and so forth. So we withdrew in protest back in those days. But the great religions still perpetuate the belief that women are somehow inferior. But if you look at the text of the Holy Bible and Quran, you'll find that it's very enlightened. And by the way, the number one interpreter of the Quran, who is head of all the Sunni worshipers, he's head of a great university, Al-Azhar in Egypt, is working side by side with me in the preparation of this book and so forth, and showing that the Quran does treat men and women equally. So there are some stirrings, partially brought about by my book, but other forces, of course, that are trying to correct these horrible problems.
Well, many have tried to correlate the violence against Mother Earth
That's right.
with the violence against women, both feminine.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, the title of my book is Time for Action, Religion, Violence, and Women, Religion, Violence, and Power. And I have one chapter in that pointing out that the commitment to violence of all kinds is a major contributing factor to the abuse of women and girls. And I point out that in 2 countries, for instance, where women are treated very well in the laws, is China is one, and the number one women's protection country in this hemisphere, nobody in this room would guess unless you've read my book, is Nicaragua. And the reason that women have such a high level of status in the laws are because women fought side by side with men in the revolution to establish a new government in Nicaragua and China. And Mao Zedong was a very powerful advocate for equal women's rights. They changed all of their laws to make women absolutely equal. And one of the great books about women's rights is called Half the Sky, and it quotes Nicholas Kristof, who's a hero of mine. Nicholas Kristof quotes Mao Zedong, who said, "Women hold up half the sky." So that shows that violence can be an avenue if women participate equally with men. But the United States, for instance, is by far the most violent country on earth. If you look at the U.S. history since the Second World War, we've been almost constantly at war. We've been at war with about 50 different nations since the Second World War, and only a brief interlude, 4 years, we didn't have any wars. I won't say when it was, but anyway. But I think one of the things that trying to stay on this very difficult question is, I think that when women are given equal status in the military, it exalts women's rights, even though you might not want to see women serving as soldiers. Or I was a little bit hesitant to see women serve on submarines, but they've authorized that. I was trying to imagine how it would have been if I'd had women. Well, I won't go into that thing. But the point is, when you give women equal rights in any part of life that's very important, like protecting our country, it boosts the status of women in all aspects of life.
How do you change, or how do you shift such a deeply embedded culture where women are treated this way? How do you start to shift men so that they begin to recognize women for who they really are and acknowledge them in decision-making roles, etc.?
Okay, first you write a book, and then you go on, and then you go on David Letterman and Jon Stewart, and you talk about it, and then you make speeches around the nation, free of charge, by the way.
Thank you.
So, and I think that individual, and now I think that Obama is now talking more and more about equality of women, and I think, as you know, the Department of Education the last 6 months has now begun to put pressure on individual universities who don't take action to correct, sexual abuse cases. So I think it has to be kind of a groundswell for change. And the United Nations is making some progress. The Foreign Minister of Great Britain, who just stepped down from office, working with Angelina Jolie, has been trying to put into international law through the United Nations Security Council the categorization of rape in war zones as a permanent crime to be addressed by the International Criminal Court, whereas in the past it has not been a real crime. And so they cannot be excused even 20 years later. A commanding officer that goes into, say, eastern Congo and rapes women, and his soldiers rape women, he can still be subject 20 years in the future now for having perpetrated those crimes. So I think there's kind of a groundswell around the world now to try to deal with this, and I think women's rights are going to be enhanced almost inevitably in the next coming years.
Well, I see that we're out of time, unfortunately, and I just hope that when I'm your age that I am as clear as you are.
Well,
isn't he amazing?
Well, I saw your comment in the previous panel when you were sitting over here, and according to your age now, you still have 50 years to go.
President Carter.
Thank you.